Let's get our Bibles out to 2 Samuel chapter 18. 2 Samuel 18. So we continue our journey through the historical books. We've mentioned to you lots of times that narrative reporting in the Bible, in the historical books, in the Gospels, and in the book of Acts specifically, are meant to have you stand by the characters and put yourself in the story and say, Lord, teach me now as I get to watch these things unfold. And God gives us a lot to understand about David. When we get to Solomon here in a couple of weeks, I think there are only 20 chapters really that are about Solomon's life. Half of them have to do with the temple. But God certainly gives us lots to know about David. And we are currently in that portion of David's later life. He dies at 70. He is now in his 60-something years old. But he had a problem, and it was a big one, with Bathsheba when he was about 50. So this has been 10 or 12 years later, or so. And David had a lot of other problems. He loved women, got married to a lot of them, had a lot of households. As a result, he didn't take very good care of his kids. Didn't have much influence in their life. Certainly, some of them had never raised his voice to correct them, as we will read here in a couple of weeks. So we are 10 or 12 years beyond the sin with Bathsheba back in chapter 10 or 11 and 12 of this book. He eventually killed her husband, covered it up, took her as his wife, had a child with her. That child died. As a result, specifically, the Lord said he took that child so that the nations of the world would know that God was just. So one of the things that Nathan the prophet, in chapter 12 said to David was that in his life, because he had done this in secret, he would suffer openly the shame and all that, what he had done, hiding it from others. So much of the reporting up until this time has been the fallout. What happened during those 12 years of David's life? What kind of suffering did he bear? What consequences followed him? One of the things that took place early on was that one of his sons, Ammon, took a liking to his half-sister Tamar, eventually raping her and then kind of discarding her. Her natural brother Absalom was furious. He expected his father David to do something about it, but David was kind of in that position where his hands were a bit tied just by his own behavior. So for 2 years, he did nothing. Absalom stewed and promised his sister he would take care of this. 2 years later, he did. He had a festival at his house, and he murdered his brother, his half-brother. As a result, Absalom had to run for his life, certainly away from the kingdom. He moved to Syria, where his in-laws lived, spent 3 years there. David missed his son, but they were miles apart. They weren't getting along, obviously. Joab, David's nephew and also the head of his army, tried to reconcile them. He finally talked him in chapter 14 to bring his boy back to Israel, but then he wouldn't see him. And 2 more years passed. And so before this meeting ever happened, 7, 8 years later, everybody's feelings were set in stone. It was way too little, too late, which led to Absalom deciding he was going to try to take the kingdom from his father. Started working the streets, started making friends in high places, gaining support for himself. And eventually, in chapter 15, he developed enough where he thought he could have a strong showing. And so he gathered the people together. His dad now was in his early 60s. He went to Hebron, he rallied the troops. Even David's closest friend, a fellow named Ahithophel, who had been his buddy since he was young, had been God's prophet, his spokesman for years, abandoned David because he was related to Bathsheba and her husband. So he had always, I think, in his back of his mind, wanted to somehow get even. This was a way to do it. When David hears that his son is gathered together in Hebron, the troops and all, and he's coming for the throne, in his 60s, but now walking with the Lord years later, certainly doing well spiritually, David decides he's going to leave the city. He doesn't want to fight, doesn't want innocent people to die. He believes if the Lord wants him to stay in power, God will bring me back. But if not, I'll leave and just that'll be it. I deserve worse. And so with his servants and his family in tow, he heads out over the Mount of Olives down to the Jordan River and heads for the wilderness. As he leaves, he sends the priests, at least two of the priests that are well known to us, Zadok and a fellow named Abiathar, back to just serve the Lord. Say, hey, you stay where God put his name. They had brought the ark. David says, take that back too. If the Lord wants me back here, he'll bring me back. But he is to stay here. The Lord will bring me back if he wants. He also sent a fellow named Hushai, another really good friend, who wanted to go with David, leave town. He said, no, if you could just go back and send me word out, use the priest boys. They run fast. Send them with information. And maybe you can be there and offer different counsel to Absalom than Ahithophel's going to do when it comes to finding out how they're going to destroy me. And so Hushai, his friend, went back. And then we ended chapter 15 with David kind of leaving the city. In chapter 16 and 17 last week, we watched David meet a couple of people on his way out. There was a fellow named Ziba. He was a servant of Jonathan's boy Mephibosheth that Saul had been caring David had been caring for some time. Ziba was a fellow that had used Mephibosheth to enrich himself, but when David found out, that kind of stopped. And so he was, rather than taking advantage of him, had to serve him. But he used this as an occasion to accuse this young boy of Jonathan's of being disloyal. And David said to Ziba, just take the stuff back, I don't care. Kind of a quick decision, lots on his plate. He was on his way out. He didn't have the whole story, certainly. It would be corrected in part later, but for now, David, just whatever, go fix it. I don't really have time for this. As he was leaving, he also ran into a fellow named Shammai, who was also a descendant of Saul, kind of a bad-mouthed guy who was good at cussing from a distance, throwing rocks at David, happy he was leaving. David's army volunteered to remove his head. David said, no, if the Lord's in this, then we'll be fine. Maybe I deserve this. So we find David in his 60s with some ups and downs in life, but basically a godly man in many ways, resigned to letting God have his way. And certainly he wasn't fighting back here. He was just being faithful. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Absalom arrives. He gets counsel from Ahithophel, David's former friend and pastor and counselor. And he says to Absalom, here's what I want you to do. Number one, take one of David's wives up on the roof where everyone can see you with her, just to declare you're in charge here, which he did. Second of all, get all the army together and let's go chase David now while he's on the run. Disorganized, unprepared, we'll be able to catch him and wipe him out. But then something interesting happened. God intervened because the Lord was watching over David. And this fellow Ahithophel, he said to Absalom, why don't you ask Hushai what he thinks? Really out of character. Certainly, you wouldn't ask your enemy to give a contrary opinion to someone you're trying to win, their confidence. But he did. And Hushai spoke up and said, well, I think you go after David now. He's a fighter, and so are the people with him. He's like a caged animal. You'll corner him. He'll come out roaring. And if you lose even a little bit, you're going to lose the whole coup. People are going to bail out. They'll be afraid that they picked the wrong side. You should wait till you have enough army to go and overwhelm him, and then the victory will be yours and you won't look the fool. And so Absalom, listening to both counsels, took Hushai's counsel. Ahithophel, realizing this was the end for him, went out and hung himself, realizing that this was not going to work out the way that he intended. So tonight we're going to look at chapter 18 and 19, which just kind of takes us to the end of this assault, if you will, this coup attempt. Next week we will finish in chapter 20 the chronology of this book. The last 21, 22, 23, last 4 chapters are asides where there are lessons the Lord wanted us to learn, but they're not in any kind of chronological order. They're kind of reaching back into David's life at various points. In 1 Kings, then, when we get there, we'll go back into the chronology with David's death and the coming to power of Solomon. But tonight, we go join David, who now finds himself in a place called Mahanaim. It was east of the Jordan. It was the place that Jacob had years earlier met those two angels when he was on his way to meet Esau. He had named the place Mahanaim. It means two camps. And so David was able to prepare for the attack. God had given him some breathing room, the delay called by the counsel of Hushai, who put to naught the counsel of Ahithophel. So we read in verse 1, chapter 18. And David numbered the people who were with him, set the captains of thousands and the captains of hundreds over them. So this was not just David by himself, as you might have imagined. There were lots of people with David there. David set out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, another third of those fighting men under the hands of Abishai, the son of his sister, Joab's brother, and 1/3 went out under the guidance of Attai the Gittite. And the king said, I'll also go surely myself. But the people said to him, you shall not go out. If we flee away, they will not care about us, not even if half of us die, will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, so you'll stay in the city. You'll help us most if you just stay put. And so David said, whatever seems good to you, I will do. And so the king sat down beside the gate as the people went out by the hundreds and by the thousands. I think the thing you don't want to, forget as we go through these chapters is David has handed this all over to the Lord. This is an old guy within 8 or 9 years of his death. He does not want to sit idly by as he did last time, which got him in trouble. He's not slothful. He wants to be diligent. He wants to do his best. He volunteers in his 60s to go lead the army. But the people are right. I mean, they're after cut the head off. And then the battle will be over. So they say, no way. One of the reasons I think that you find David is so loved by the people is his willingness to serve with, a very approachable guy. They will call him in chapter 21, it'll be a while yet, they will call him the lamp of Israel. Here's a man that we totally look up to. So instead of a 4-part army going out to defend, if you will, or to take on Absalom's forces, they send out 3. 1/3 of the army goes with Joab, another third goes with his brother Abishai, another third goes with this guy Attai the Hittite, who we met last time, if you were here, David's friend, but he was a foreigner. He had just arrived in Jerusalem to see David with 600 guys as they were leaving, and David said, man, you guys should bail out of here. We're in trouble. And the guy goes, I don't care if you're in trouble, I'm going to go with you. And so he is there to lead part of the army as well. Verse 5, the king then commanded, as he was sitting in the gate, Joab and Abishai and Attai, and he said this, deal gently for my sake with that young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave this command to the captains concerning Absalom. And so the people went out to fight in the fields of battle against Israel, and the battle took place in the woods of Ephraim. And the people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David. A great slaughter, some 20,000 took place that day. The battle there was scattered all over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. We gather in verse 5 that the reviewing stand as the army went out, all of the soldiers, everyone heard David said, don't hurt Absalom. Take it easy on Absalom. Now, this was a boy he's been estranged for years. It's almost too little, too late. Lots of regrets, but still nothing had been resolved. And so that was his order, one order. Don't kill him. Notice that David wisely took and chose the battlefield, the woods and the hills of Ephraim, which were just north of Jerusalem. They would eliminate to a great extent, because of what it is, the benefit of horses and chariots. You could forget about them. They don't work. And so they would negate much of the advantage of having a lot of troops who were poorly trained, hastily trained, especially in that environment. And it seems that the 20,000 deaths we read about, by the way, that's about as many people that are lost their lives in any of the large battles of World War II. The Lord tells us more of them, however, died with the elements than in actual combat, maybe running for their lives, running off a cliff, unaccustomed to guerrilla warfare and the woods and the jungles that they now found themselves in. So the battle was horrible, and it was quick, and within a day, David's armies David was in a position without even being in the battlefield that the Lord was protecting this man's life. But then we are turned in our attention, verse 9, to Absalom, who met the servants of David. Absalom was riding on a mule, and the mule went under a thick bough of a great terebinth or almond tree. His head got caught in the terebinth. He was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule under him went on. Now, there is some discussion amongst Bible scholars. I didn't get involved with it, I'm just reporting it. Whether he got caught by his head or by his hair. The Hebrew word is head or top or chief, all depending on context. Josephus, in his history of the Jew or antiquity of the Jews, wrote it was by his hair. It doesn't really matter, he got stuck. He was riding a mule, which meant he wasn't going into battle. He was riding around as a royalty. This is, you ride a horse to battle. This was a ceremonial royalty and maybe retreating quicker than most. Whatever the case, he finds himself wedged pretty good in this tree where he's hanging in midair, and it appears none of his troops stopped or volunteered to help or protect him. I remember reading years ago that when you win hearts by deceit, they're usually not around when the going gets tough, and that seems to be the case here. He's just left by himself. I mean, all these folks fighting and no one there to help him. All forsook him. Even the mule, it seemed, had enough sense to call it a day. I think A.W. Pink, in his commentary on this chapter, wrote of Absalom, he was hanging between heaven and earth, and he was fit for neither. There was at least an indication that, he didn't repent of himself. He had plenty of time to wait and to think about it. Apparently, from all that we read here, he might have been hanging there for a little while and could have worked it out with God. I always think about that letter Jesus sent in the Revelation chapter 2 to the Thyatira church, where he said, I gave them time to repent, but they didn't. And I think about Absalom, with all he's coming. He doesn't die right away. He hangs there in midair waiting to see what will happen to him next. We read in verse 10 that there was a certain man who came to Joab, the head of the army of that portion, and he said, I just saw Absalom, he's hanging in a almond tree, a terebinth tree. And Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? Why did you not strike him down to the ground? I'd have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. Great reward, isn't it? And the man said to Joab, though I would receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against this king's son. For in our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai that we should beware lest any would touch this young man, Absalom. Otherwise, I would have dealt falsely against my own life. There is nothing hidden from the king. You yourself would have turned against me. So in the midst of all these people switching sides, here's a young guy who's very loyal. He's obedient to his clear orders. He's not about to lay his hand on Absalom. He goes, tells his superior. He says to Joab, who suggests killing him, you could have given me 100 times what you're offering me, and I still wouldn't have done it. I couldn't disobey the king. If I had done that, you would have turned on me. So in the midst of all of these side switchers, here's a faithful man and a good soldier. But Joab is not. And so we read in verse 14, Joab said, I cannot linger here with you, or I got to go. He took 3 spears in his hand, and then he thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of this tree. And his 10 young men who carried his armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. In other words, this was a sickening, cruel, bloody slaughter of a man who was hanging from a tree. Not just Absalom, but his trainees, the folks that looked up to him. With that, verse 16, Joab blew the trumpet. The people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held them back. And they took Absalom and they cast him in a very large pit in the woods. They laid a very large heap of stones upon him. And then all of Israel, those in the north that had joined him in the rebellion, they fled everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his life had taken and set up a pillar for himself there in the valley of the king. He said, I don't have any sons to keep my name in remembrance. And so he had built a pillar after put his own name on it. And it is to this day called Absalom's monument. So Absalom dies. The coup is over. Joab recalls the forces. They bury him somewhere in the middle of nowhere, a brutal guy. And for the second time in David's reign of many years, the first time was Saul, a civil war is avoided, and the genocide of his people is avoided as well. So Absalom gets put in a grave kind of with contempt, a far cry from what he envisioned for himself earlier on when he built his own headstone. We are told here in verse 18 that Absalom wrote that he had no sons. Now, if you go back and read chapter 14, I think we're by it already, but he eventually had 3. So we don't know if that was done prior to having children, or maybe they died and he didn't have any sons left. We don't know. But in any case, his coup attempt and his shot at glory didn't last very long. We read in Job, I think it's chapter 20, the triumphing of the wicked is short. The joy of the hypocrite just for a moment. Dreams of self-glory fizzled away. God resists the proud. In any event, God protected David once more. This was the concept. If you go back to cause and effect, this all started 12 years earlier. But God had forgiven and restored David. Absalom never found a place of really rest or of peace. Verse 19, Ahimaz, who is the son of the priest. And by the way, the priest's kids had been running back and forth bringing David news about how what was going in the city. Said now to Joab, let me run and take news to the king of how the Lord has avenged him of his enemy. But Joab said, you shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead. And so Joab called for a Cushite. He said, go tell the king what you have seen. And he began to, first he bowed himself to Joab, and then he ran off. Meanwhile, Ahimaaz, the priest's son, said to Joab again, but whatever happens, please let me run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son? You have no news ready. But whatever happens, let me run. And so he waited a while, thought the guy had been, certainly gone ahead of him. Go ahead and run. But Ahimaaz ran by way of the plains. He had a shortcut, and he was fast. And he eventually outran this fellow. So the insurrection is dead. David has lost his son. I think Joab was a little concerned with how David might receive the news. The priest's son could have gotten hurt if the king got angry. He liked this boy. He calls him his own boy. Joab calls him my son later on. So he doesn't want to send him in to bring that news, though he knows it. And so rather than risking his life, when he hears about it, he decides to send a slave, a Cushite, that he apparently felt was expendable. In fact, I think verse 22, Joab even calls this boy, my son, don't you run. So he sends a slave. But, the priest boy wanted to be involved. He was good at running. He'd been running stuff back and forth from the capital. And I think Joab, when he believed the Cushite was far enough ahead, said, all right, go ahead. But he gives him this admonishment. You don't have any message. There's nothing you can say. There's no message you can deliver. You have no official title. Don't you dare say a word. And off he went. I think I like the example because we meet people sometimes that want to run. They have great zeal, but they have no message. Right? They want to talk. They want to share. They want to teach. I had a guy one time get saved on a Sunday night at a service, and then come Wednesday night and ask if he could teach. I said, teach what? He goes, man, I've been learning a lot. I said, why don't you just wait like a week or two? But he wanted to run, man. He wanted to run. I got something to say. But he needed to sit for a while, I think, and learn. You know, he had partial information. He wasn't representing no one. He just wanted to get involved. It's a good thing, but you should have something to say. So it's important that you and I don't just run, but we have a message to deliver. And I think we can only bring to others what God has delivered first to us. If you look at guys like Paul or Timothy or Peter, they each ran with a particular message, but it was one that moved them with conviction and purpose, and God spoke to them clearly. So this young man, he's excited. He wants to serve. He grew up in a priestly home. He just wants to be a part. He knows the battle is over. He's also aware that the king's son is dead, but he's been told not to say anything. So what does he do? He runs. But David, you see, David knows the priest boy. He doesn't know the slave. Verse 24, David was sitting between the two gates of the city. The watchman was up on the roof over the gate to the wall. He lifted up his eyes and he saw a man running alone. The watchman cried out and said to the king, I see a man running. And the king said, if he's alone, there's news in his mouth. And as he was rapidly drawing near, the watchman said as he looked over the gate, there's another man also running alone. And the king said, he also brings news. And so as the watchman watched, he said in verse 27, I think that the running of the first is like the running of Amahaz, the son of the priest Zadok. And the king said, he has good news. He always comes with good news. He's on our side, basically, right? Verse 28. But Ahaz came out and said to the king, all is well, bowed down to the face to the ground and said, blessed be the Lord your God. He's delivered the men who raised up against you, against my lord the king. And the king said, is the young man Absalom safe? And Ahaz said, when Joab sent the king's servant and me your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I didn't know what it was all about. Aha, lying. See, sometimes running is fun when you're delivering good news. Not so much fun to deliver bad news. And so he found himself now wishing maybe he'd never run. But he had to tell the truth. So he claims ignorance, but he doesn't want to say anything at all. Just then, verse 31, the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, there is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all of those who rose up against you. And the king said to the Cushite, is the young man Absalom safe? To which the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you, who to do you harm, be like that young man. In other words, the news was horrible. The king was deeply moved. He went up to the chamber over the gate. He wept. And he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. Now, David's grief here is far different than you find recorded when his son with Bathsheba died years earlier. If you remember when he finally heard that this boy had passed, he got up and he cleansed himself and washed and ate, and the servants were surprised that he would act so rationally after the bad news came that he had passed. And they asked David about it, and he said, I know that boy won't come back to me, but I know one day I'm going to go be with him. He knew where that boy would end up. He doesn't have any kind of assurance about that for Absalom. So his grief is far more difficult. He's not sure of the eternal destiny of his son, of where he stood with God, of the life he had been living. And so with great sorrow and with great sadness, he's not at all sure that Absalom's going to make it, like he believed of his little boy. And so what does he say? Lord, I wish I'd have died in their place. I was ready. I'm not sure that he was ready. years of separation, lack of much parenting, unwillingness to solve a conflict, escalating bitterness, brings us to this horrible place where Absalom dies without a resolution, and David has no assurance of the eternal future. So I guess you don't let things go. If you can, fix them. And David was certainly in that position, like I think anybody that loses someone where you're not sure where they're at with the Lord, that you just have to leave it with God. And in the last moment, we have plenty of examples in the Bible of thieves on the cross, who were in the last of their days make a good decision. No one else would have known. Had the Lord not written it down, we'd have never known. So you kind of have to leave it with that. But with all that David was piled up, you can just imagine how this 60-plus-year-old man was reacting, even though the coup was gone and he was safe to return home. Well, we read in verse 1 of chapter 19 that Joab was told that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom, and so that the victory that day turned into mourning for everyone. For the people heard that the king was grieving for his son, and the people stole back into the city that day as people who were ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face and cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son." David's grief was so overwhelming that everyone around them who had risked their lives to leave town, to go to the battlefield, rather than coming home rejoicing in the victory, now came home as if they were ashamed that somehow they'd failed in their duties because Absalom was dead. And apparently David carried on for quite some time, kind of alienated himself from the people. Joab came to him in the house, verse 5, and he said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life and the lives of your sons and of your daughters, the lives of your wives and of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, that it would have pleased you well. Therefore arise, go out, speak comfort to your servants. For I swear by the Lord that if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night, and it'll be worse for you than all of the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now." And the king arose and he went out and sat in the gate, told the people, and there's the king sitting in the gate, and all the people came before the king because before everyone had fled to their tents. So David's reaction kind of sat not very well with the people. They felt slighted by David's inordinate grief over his rebellious son without any gratefulness, without any kindness. And then we get this word, this wisdom from old crusty Joab. Not exactly the guy you'd look to for wisdom, but he was right. David in a rage, he went to David kind of in a rage and with crude but very straight advice, just said, "Seems to me if we were all dead and he was alive, it'd been great, huh?" And David kind of saw through it. It was a critical time for the coup. If the people perceived that they had lost the capacity for David to lead them, then I think anarchy would have followed. It needed to be dealt with. The people were, first they didn't have a leader, then they had a coup, and now they didn't know where they stood. So, that's pretty logical, but David is pretty emotional. And so David heeds the advice of Joab. He makes himself available in the gates, which is, where the judgments were made. And again, the people hearing it pretty quickly, the word began to spread. We read in verse 9 that all of the people were in a dispute throughout all of the tribes in Israel. Those are in the northern area where most of the rebellion had come from. "The king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now we have fled from the land because of Absalom." There in Israel in the north, people were feeling guilty that they had either sided with Absalom, or just hid, waiting it out, not really taking a stand at all, playing Switzerland, in the middle. the grass wasn't always greener. And notice what the people say. David's always been there for us. But when he needed us, we weren't there. And so we should go back and tell him we're sorry. In fact, in verse 11, King David sent to the priests and said, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to come to bring the king home to his house, since the words of all of Israel have come to the king and to his very house?" So they went to apologize, but David's own tribe seemed to be more reticent to come and help. "You are my brethren," he writes to them. "You are my flesh and blood. Why are you the last now to bring back the king? And then say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me and more also, if you are not to be the commander of the army before me continually in the place of Joab." And so he swayed the hearts of all of the people of Judah, just as the heart of one man, so that they sent for the king, "Return you and all of your servants." And the king returned, came to the Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go to meet the king, to escort him across the Jordan. So David was a little bit hurt. A pretty emotional guy, he's crying. He ignores everyone who's sacrificed for him. When he finally gets any communication, it's the people that have been the least faithful to him that seem to apologize first. His own tribe seems to have very little to do with him. It's interesting that you don't always find the greatest support among the people you count as the closest to you. And that's unfortunately the way it sometimes works. Well, David did a couple of things. Verse 13, he decided to replace Joab. Joab had killed just about everyone David had told to leave alone. Joab was an uncontrollable guy. And interestingly enough, Amasa, if you were with us last week, was the head of Absalom's rebellious forces, though he was a friend, at least for some time, to David. And so David replaces Joab. Joab also, by the way, had the goods on him about Uriah. Anybody who had joined the rebellion would feel comfortable coming back now because David made the head of the rebellion the head of his army. So he just wanted to keep the doors open. He's quick to forgive. David is a guy that is, in many ways, just so soft-hearted in many of these responses. Verse 14 tells us that the response was unanimous. "Come home, David," was the cry of the nation. So David heads home. He's escorted by many from his own tribe. When we run into our little buddy Shemaiah again, he's the guy who curses and throws stones. He was a descendant of Benjamin, of Saul's tribe. And he hurried and he came down with the men of Judah to meet David. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, as well as this fellow Ziba, the crook who had taken advantage of Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. And he came with 15 sons and 20 servants, and they all came to meet the king as if, all right, everything's fine now. And a ferry boat came to carry the king across with his household to do what he thought was good. So Shemaiah, the rock-throwing curser of David, comes with 1,000 people, not with rocks, to apologize. And this fella, Ziba, well, he comes to apologize as well. He realizes you maybe get exposed here. He's been lying. David accepts for now the apologies of this fellow Shemaiah, but let me just say this to you. On his deathbed, when he is saying goodbye to his son Solomon, he is being anointed as king, he says to him, "I promised not to kill Shemaiah, but you didn't. And so if you could just take care of that weasel for me, that'd be just good." The difference between God's forgiveness and man's is that God's is permanent. David had a difficult time not remembering some of those slights. God doesn't remember them anymore. I might offend you and you might tell me I'm forgiven and remember it for 30 years. If we get in an argument, you might even bring it up. Well, back in 92. You've heard that before, haven't you? That won't happen with Jesus. Our slate is clean. He doesn't keep a record of wrongs. He remembers them no more. But David's not quite that way. Did this guy deserve it? In the Old Testament law sense, he did, because of the treatment he has to the king. But it's an interesting that we'll follow up on here in a couple of weeks. Verse 24. Now Mephibosheth, that was the boy of Jonathan's who'd been hurt in his feet, right? And dropped on his head when he was a kid. And so he comes to meet David. David had been told by this fellow Ziba that he had forsaken David. That hadn't been true. He had not cared for his feet, nor trimmed his mustache, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he'd returned in peace. He was really worried about David and interceding for him. And so it was when he came to Jerusalem to meet the king that the king said, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" And he answered, "My lord, O king, my servant deceived me. For your servant said, I will saddle up a donkey for myself, and I'll ride on and go to the king, because your servant is lame, and he has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like the angel of God, therefore do what is right in your own eyes." Threw himself on David's mercy. For all of my father's house were but dead men before my lord the king, yet you set your servant among those who sit at your own table. Therefore, what right have I to cry out any more to the king? And so the king said, "Why do you speak any more of your matters? I have said you and Ziba can now divide the land." And so Mephibosheth said, "Rather, let him take it all, inasmuch as my lord the king has come home in peace to his own house." So David, I think, tired of all the betrayal, no mood to try to fix it all, responds to his kindness by saying, "All right, you get half of it back." And just kind of left it at that. I don't know if he just didn't know who to believe anymore, or he just had enough of this underhanded dealings. But in any regard, David, again, doesn't make the best decision here, but he, lets it go, and that's about it. And then we run into this fellow, verse 31, Barzillai. He was from Gilead. He had come from Regalim and was crossing the Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. Except that Barzillai was a very aged man. He was 80 years old. If you're nearing 80, you're a very aged man. And he provided the king with supplies while he was there at Mahanaim because he was a very rich man. And so the king said to Barzillai, "Come across with me. I'll provide for you while you are with me in Jerusalem." But Barzillai said to the king, "How long can I live that I should go up with the king to Jerusalem? I'm 80 years old today. Can I even discern between good and bad? Can your servant taste what I eat or what I drink? Can I hear any longer the voice of men singing and women singing? Why then should your servant be a further burden to my lord the king? Your servant will go a little while with you across the Jordan, and why should the king repay me with such a reward? So please, let your servant turn back again, that I might die in my own city, near the grave of my mother and father. But here is your servant Chimham." That happened to be his son. "Let him cross over with my lord the king, and do what seems good to you to him." And so the king said, "Chimham shall cross over with me. I will do what seems good to me. Now therefore you request of me, I'll do it for you." And all of the people went across the Jordan. And when the king had crossed over, the king kissed this old timer, blessed him, and he turned around and went home. You can read some of the age effects in verse 35. You don't know right from wrong. Can't taste what's good or hear anymore. Sounds about right. And you become a burden to everyone. He had helped David much in his exile. He was a rich man. So he sends David his son Chimham. 400 years from now, you can write it in the margin, Jeremiah chapter 41, verse 17, tells us that David, who lived in Bethlehem in the region, gave a land around Bethlehem to this young man for the kindness his father had shown to him. In fact, you'll read there that they came from the habitation of Chimham, which is near Bethlehem. So we aren't told any much else here, but David apparently granted this young man quite a portion of land for the goodness of his father to him all of those years, and sends everybody out, kisses the dad, who turns around and leaves, and that's the last we hear of him. Verse 40, now the king went on to Gilgal with this son who went with him, and all the people of Judah escorted the king, as well as half the people from Israel. So half of Israel, all of Judah came out to accompany David. Remember, in the north, half of them might very well have been afraid to show their faces. We don't know for sure. Just then, all of the men of Israel came to the king and said to the king, why have your brethren, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household and all of David's men with him across the Jordan? So all the men of Judah answered and said, because the king is a close relative of ours. Why then are you so angry over this matter? Have you ever eaten at the king's expense? Or has he given us any gifts? And the men of Israel answered the men of Judah, you have 10 shares in the king, therefore we also have more right to David than you. Why do you despise us? Why were we not the first to advise bringing him back, which they had been because they were guilty? Yet the words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel, and so I guess in this case they won the argument. There had been an ongoing feud, and you should probably remember it, between the north and the south. Eventually, when Solomon dies and the kingdom is split, 10 of the tribes will go north. Only Judah and Benjamin will stay in the south. But this feud had been going on for quite some time. You might remember that when David finally came to the throne, for the first 7.5 years after Saul's death, he was only supported by 2 tribes, basically his own and some of the Benjamites. That was it. No one else was really willing to stand with David, and so there became this great divide. When David's grandson Rehoboam comes to the throne after his father Solomon's death, this feud will mobilize them into 2 nations, and we'll have a lot to learn then about what goes on from one to the other. So, like I said, we only have one more chapter, just chapter 20. We will maybe take more than that next week, I suspect, but only chapter 20 kind of ends the chronology. And then if you're taking notes in your Bible, you want to jump all the way to First Kings chapter 1 to begin that chronology again as we pick up with David old and 70 and on his way out. If you look at David's tonight, because we want to stand next to our characters in the narrative, David had plenty of reasons to hate Absalom. I think he could have harbored a grudge for years. He murdered one of his sons. He stole the hearts of the people away. He led a coup against his old father, intent on killing him. It wasn't just going to hurt him, he was going to kill him. Yet David's love, I think, reflects God's love for us. It's unworthy, but he offers it to him. David's orders to his troops was only one thing: be kind to my son. When they came to give a report of the battle, he only had one question: how's my boy? Is he safe? Hearing of his death, David was so sad that he about alienated himself from the people he was serving. Love is measured often in the obstacles it can overcome. I think Absalom saw very little love from those who left him hanging in the tree. David found a lot of love being dislodged from the throne. Love is measured by the giver's cost. So David let this go way too long. But had he dealt with it sooner, I think maybe the Lord could have brought peace, but it didn't happen. But love is all about cost, isn't it? When David will later, not much later, 3 or 4 chapters later, have to buy a threshing floor to stop a plague that he has kind of brought upon himself. The Lord will instruct him to buy a piece of land to build a temple on. The man who owns that piece of land offers to give it to David. Just take it, man. We're all dying. We need peace. And David said, I can't give God something that didn't cost me anything. And so he gave full price for this land to this landowner only because he equated giving with love. It costs. And he would buy it, understanding love sacrificed. And I think that ultimately brings you to that very same place where, because it's the same field in which Jesus would give his life for the sins of the world. Read ahead next week. Let's try to do 2 chapters at least as we approach the last years of David's life. And then we'll see what the Lord wants to tell us next time. Father, it is amazing to stand or to sit here together and go through these stories, realizing that you could have told us anything you wanted us to know. And yet you have reserved these chapters, these words, these incidents, these stories, these insights, given them to us, as Paul will say to the Corinthians and to the Romans, for our learning, so that we, through the patience of the scriptures, might come to a place of hope, that we would learn from your word what it means to walk with you. And so whether we watch David struggling in his hard-headedness, unforgiving heart, or we find him devastated by letting it go so long, that you can teach us what it means to walk with you, to take that lesson. We watch David still suffering a dozen years later from decisions he had made well in the past. And yet now he walks with you, but he still hurts. He puts you first. He trusts you implicitly. He does a lot of things well, but he's still broken. Keep us, Lord, from sin so that we might not have to suffer its consequence. May we rather just live for you, put you first, die to ourselves. And may the lesson of David, him, the king, restored in his late 60s by the Lord's grace, that we might learn from him, Lord, that you're able to do more than we could ask or think. May we trust you tonight with our situations. And whatever you're going to tonight, look, let God have it. You know, the Bible talks about casting your cares before the Lord. But that means leaving them there. It's not a yo-yo deal. Here, Lord, hold this, no, give it back. He cares for you. He knows what you need before you ask. He's well aware of the things you're facing. We might very well sometimes suffer as a result of our own decisions. But God has a way of restoring, delivering, and making new. So as the Lord speaks to you tonight, act upon what he says to your heart, what he shows you. Because we come together every week just to let Lord speak to us and let your word show us the ways in which we should go. If tonight you don't know Jesus as your Lord, would you come and talk to one of the pastors? It would be their greatest joy to pray with you. God would answer the prayer of salvation in a moment's time. Call upon my name, he says, and you'll be saved. Not might be, not could be, will be saved. If tonight you'll come to Jesus, he'll take you just the way you are, give you his life, forgive your sins. Not like David forgot that fellow Shammai, but completely, forever, eternally so. All you have to do is come and ask. And the Lord is waiting to hear from you. Shall we stand?